Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Fear from 1996. So, I feel like I need to, come up with, a warning, before we go into this. I do not condone, of course, a person who is to fall in love with somebody and then abuse them. I don't condone that. I don't enjoy any aspect of that. Um, I don't really and I don't really there's portions of here where I think we should all realize that there are parts where you can kind of question whether it feels right or not to like this film. I get that, and I want to just say that right out of the gate is just hey, I can say, because I'm going to, I enjoy this movie. I love the really aggressive nature that Mark Wahlberg is to go into this film, even though I do not condone a man either aggressively grabbing or hitting or whatever a woman. That kind of seems to be a thing where I would just say that easily right away, that I don't enjoy that kind of thing. But the overall performance of certain people I enjoy. Or eventually, we have this point when David is to seemingly be this nice, innocent guy, and then all of a sudden we eventually just start to see him do these kind of these scenes or maneuvers or whatever, and we eventually start to find out more about David's character. And I'm like, wow, this movie gets really interesting because how can you not also like movies like Cape Fear, like the Robert De Niro film, when really also looking at this movie and just be like, okay, so this is kind of like an updated version of Cape Fear, but it's slightly tweaked to eventually have David's character seemingly fall for Nicole, and then eventually David starts to eventually find out about Nicole's family, and all of a sudden is like, oh, okay, all right. And so it seems that Steve, who is Nicole's daughter, or reverse, Steve is Nicole's father. That's what I was wanting to say. And it seems like he's very protective, and it seems that when Nicole is seemingly going through a rough relationship, Steve wants to try and protect her because, of course, he's her father. So eventually, Steve kind of wants to nip this in the butt because he just doesn't like David. There's something about him that just rubs him the wrong way. And usually, in every one of these movies where someone is to instantly rub someone the wrong way, it's like, well, that person has to be right. There's never a scenario where, yeah, I know what it is about this person, but it just, he's just not right. And then eventually it comes up that this person is perfectly fine at the end of the movie. No, there has to be something deep down, that is to just say that this person is just a killer or a murderer or something that is to be so awful that, oh my god, I can't believe that, nobody realized that this guy was this bad of a person. It's kind of nice seeing also Melissa Milano in this movie. Just because I like to see Melissa Milano get work, or Alyssa Milano get work. I remember her in Double Dragons, and of course Who's the Boss, and of course she ends up getting the freaking Guardians of Galaxy ship named after her, Milano. But yeah, so it's really nice to just kind of see her here, even though she ends up kind of playing eventually this character that is just kind of she has kind of her character has issues also, but then eventually tries to eventually be the a good person at the end of this. So with that said, yeah, so for anyone who hasn't seen this movie, it's an interesting film, but it's also kind of like an obsession kind of film where all of a sudden David is to realize it's well, the only girl that is to be good enough for me is Nicole, and so eventually, when Nicole is to see more of David's life without David realizing it, Nicole is immediately just like, I want nothing to do with this guy. But David is just like, but wait a minute, but like, but let me just help you understand. Let me just like, uh, let me just. All you just need to do is to get to know me more, and it just kind of seems that Nicole is to get to know David, and we eventually even have Steve, who is to kind of find out that David is a lie or a sham, or like whatever he is to say about his previous life is to not be what it actually is. And so eventually, like, we slowly but surely eventually have Nicole realize this, because she was so just caught up in the fact that probably David was handsome, or probably David was seemingly this nice, sensitive guy, and that reasonably, uh, like, Nicole was just like, well, uh, there's just something about this guy, and like, he's so mysterious. He's just so like, there's something about him that just like is consuming, or just seductive, or just like lures me in to where it's undeniable, almost Dracula style, where like there's something about this guy that I just can't quite yet uh give up on right away. And so evidently that's the David nature of things. So uh so with that said, that's all I really want to say about this movie in a very cryptic like sense. So teeing it up, what is this movie about? So uh we end up having Nicole's character and Margot's character eventually going to this one seemingly diner-ish like place, and Nicole is to seemingly be eye to eye with David. And so all of a sudden they end up going to a club together, which leads to them running off out of this club together. And so when David is with Nicole and they're like by themselves, and Nicole is to mention this lavish story about his whole life, and that it seems that David is to have these perfect parents, and it seems like they never argue, supposedly. Um, and then Nicole is to mention like her kind of family and how she's kind of dealing with things, and that I think evidently like I'm kind of curious about the whole like family situation also with Nicole and her family, because like, is Steve like Nicole's father or stepfather? Because supposedly um Steve's uh younger son is like, he already has another dad. So how does that all work? Like, did Steve eventually come into this family, and then like, I don't know how that all worked, but you would think that after this whole moment, like, you would think that this family would be like stronger connected together uh, after this moment, especially. But yeah, uh, so eventually, what happens is that it seems Nicole ends up finding out certain things about David's real, legitimate, aggressive nature, where eventually David ends up doing some things which we'll talk about in spoilers. And so Nicole is having this kind of back and forth thing with David. Like, she is to be afraid of him, but then she still finds something seductive or just consuming about him, where she just needs to forgive David. And but then when she finally ends up seeing who David really is, behind closed doors, let's just say, Nicole runs away from him and decides, like, okay, this is over. She ends up giving her dad a little note saying that she was wrong about David and that it's over. And so eventually David is to try to figure out, because he tattooed her name on his chest, that it's like Nicole forever. And I'm like, oh my god, like, that is just so like obsessive. So so David is to eventually try to figure out how Nicole is to understand, so David is trying to figure out how to I guess re-get back with Nicole, and or figure out how Nicole just wants to run away from David. And so David is starting to go through Nicole's friends to either kill them off or to eventually try to kind of grab them and just be like, okay, how does Nicole know about what had gone on? And so eventually this just leads for there to all of a sudden this being a back and forth thing between both David and Steve, Nicole's father. And eventually this just starts to escalate to uh, just basically both David and Steve like just destroying one another's uh, like highest possessions, which is Steve is to eventually be uh, we'll save that for spoilers also. So eventually this just escalates to have David and his group of guys that he is to live with, because I don't want to say like what exactly title they are, because I don't know exactly that, like they could have just been people that conveniently found one another and just became friends. And so like we also are to have suspicions that David is to have some drug ring going on, but it never really comes to that. But anyways, so eventually David and his people that he's with, that he lived with, are to decide to go and break into uh, Steve and Laura's home because they had destroyed uh, David's home. So I guess we have to say that. But anyways, so eventually there's an escalation here, and eventually there's a point when uh, Steve, Laura, and Nicole, and all the family eventually have to go and try to protect this home from these guys and figure out some magical way to try to get police here or to get to some kind of safety. And so, yeah. So, with that said, let's go into that double five time territory because it's about that time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we're going to spoil this movie. Before we go, where could you go out of your way to say that you can see this film? Well, if you don't conveniently have HBO Max, because you can dare in fact watch this film on HBO Max. If you don't have HBO Max, because maybe you don't have the affordability to be able to do that, you can probably go into a number of apps that I've been probably using fairly consistently. You can, one, go into Fox HD Movies. You can go and search Google Play to go out of your way to find that app. That dare in fact, it'll say Fox HD Movies on the logo, but the title will say something different. You can go into a Google search and immediately find apps like letters C Movies, and go ahead and go into that app and basically be able to watch anything for absolutely free. Or you can also go into an app that I don't know has this film because it's kind of like iffy whether or not this app has certain films. There's also another app that I've been using called TV Crush that can find a certain combination of certain kind of movies that you can watch for free. But if anything, if you conveniently have HBO Max, dare in fact, watch it there. It's easy. So, and you won't have any ads. So, with that said, let's get into spoilers. So really just the very beginning of this film, like I said, we end up having Nicole going to school, and like there's some kind of like some stereotypical parenting stuff going on in this film. Nicole is to eventually go off to school, and Steve is like, is that what people are wearing these days? He's like, it looks like you're wearing something that like shrunk. And I'm like, and I'm honestly going into this movie just kind of like thinking how many numerous times like the character in this film have to wear this like kind of low tops or like are to specifically have like cleavage on, and I'm like, okay, like I guess we're doing that kind of film where it's just like how many low tops can these women have? Because it's like, good grief. Like I'm looking at Reese Witherspoon and I'm like, good grief, woman, you got some real low toppage going on there. But whatever. Like I guess like how many movies is she probably gonna do that are like this that eventually can show some uh, like sex appeal or whatever? Because I guess that's a very rare thing in these films for someone to do that or pull that off or whatever. So Nicole is to go off to school, and it seems that we are to have Steve, who is to supposedly get tickets for some concert, some band concert. I think it's James Taylor, I think is what they end up saying in the movie. And so like Steve ends up forgetting about it, and he's like, oh, like, hey, I'll get the tickets, like be sure I'll get them. And so uh so eventually we have a moment where like Steve is to eventually talk to his son, which I don't think is even in IMDb here. And I'm not even going to take the long stretch of time to figure this out. Anyways, so Steve is to ask about whether or not his stepfather goes and is to watch any of his games or whatever. And the son is like, well, no, like all my dad cares about is hitting on the ladies and trying to get a date out of it. And so Steve is like, oh, okay. Well, I don't even know why they even had that kind of line or whatever. Like, I don't think it really mattered. Like, because we were never going to have a build of that story, or like all of a sudden we aren't going to have like Steve's son's or stepson's like dad coming in here and finding out what happened or whatever, and that's going to save them. I don't think that was going to be a thing that was going to happen. So it just seemed like a random like thing to add in the story. So uh, so eventually, what ends up happening is that uh, eventually Nicole is going off with Margot and Gary to eventually go to this one diner where it seems like they're going to get some certain pies to go or something like that. So all of a sudden, we end up seeing this one guy who I believe is Logan. Um, and David's character playing pool. So all of a sudden, Nicole or Alyssa's character, Margot, is eventually see Logan's character, and eventually Nicole is to see David's character. And I'm thinking like, yeah, this is probably during the Marky Mark days, where eventually like Mark Wahlberg had like just six pack abs like every single minute of his life because he like rigorously trained. Like especially when you have Mark Wahlberg, who supposedly has those famous like 4 in the morning workouts, and eventually there was to be like certain guys that wanted to go and like try to do the 4 in the morning workouts with Mark Wahlberg, and I'm just like, yeah, like you could just train any time of the day, buddy. Like you could just train whenever. Like you don't have to train at 4 in the morning. But I guess when really looking at it, that's probably the only time that he can squeeze in a workout. But like, hey, like whatever. Um, anyways, what do I know? Uh, so Nicole and or Nicole and David, let's get it right, have these googly eyes for one another, and so they end up getting this banner for this, I guess, this club called Fetish, which I guess they eventually go to because they have nothing better to do in this town, possibly. So later on, what ends up happening is Steve eventually is to come home to eventually realize that he can't go to this concert because he has to eventually go into this meeting, or he has to do something where he has to go and do something business related, and so he has to meet the concert. Nicole, as well as just everybody, is just so frustrated, and Laura is just be like, well, you just cancel your meeting, just cancel whatever you have to do for work. And Steve is like, well, then, like, how would we eat? Like, how do we like, I have to keep doing what I'm doing here. And so Laura is just frustrated because Steve is putting his job first before his family. And then it eventually seems that Steve finally does seemingly uh, put his job before, or put his family before his job. And then I'm like, thank God. So this guy isn't just completely glued to his job, and like anything can happen. so, uh, so because Nicole is not going to this concert, and like she was telling her friends that like she can't really do anything tonight because she has to go to this concert, she has this family thing to go to. There's this one spot where both Steve and Nicole uh, were talking about this concert, and that Nicole had to remind Steve that she had gone to this concert once before, and Steve was like, "Since when did you go to a concert with me and your mother?" And Nicole ends up rattling off the exact year of when they actually went, and so Steve is like, "Well, like I'm sorry, I don't remember as good as things as you do, because like I just don't have a memory." And so Nicole is like, "Well, get an updated chip." Like just to say that like, hey, come up with a better way of getting a better memory of things. Like if it was probably some work related thing, he'd probably remember it like that, but like considering it's family related, he has to take some time, just like, oh yeah, like to kind of have somebody remind him about parts of his life, because he quickly forgets, especially if it's not work related, I guess. So but it's really probably just to say that, like, well, Steve's older, and so he can't remember everything that happened, and and whatever. Uh, so yeah, so Nicole goes off to this fetish club, and so it seems that eventually Margot's character is to seemingly go and spot into this crowd of this Logan character that she had seen before. And so she's like, I'm going to go after that guy. And so Nicole ends up going off onto her own and just kind of just leaning against this seemingly this one metal thing. And so all of a sudden, David just appears out of nowhere like magic. And so Nicole is like, hey, why aren't you dancing with someone? And David is like, because nobody wants to dance with me. Uh, so all of a sudden, like, both David and Nicole don't even dance. Like, they don't even, like, slow dance or nothing. They don't have the time for it, weirdly. Because all of a sudden, we end up having people that are all of a sudden I guess getting too aggressive with the music, and so all of a sudden they end up starting to crash and break a lot of the stage things of this club, to where all of a sudden David and Nicole are kind of um, around this club trying to figure out where to go. So David makes the idea for them to go up to the roof, and so now that they're on the roof, Nicole is like, well, where do we go now? And David's like, I don't know. I think we'll find some exit or something. So they end up firing. They end up finding a like fire escape. So they go down this fire escape, and so then there seems to be a group of, or a ton of people following the same thing that they're doing, and so eventually they rebump back into Logan and Margot. So eventually David and Nicole, they go down this fire escape, and so both of them end up driving off, and so David is to tell Nicole about his parents and how it seems like they rarely ever argue about like The only thing that they ever really argue about is just common stuff, like probably like what to watch on a Tuesday night or something like that. So to kind of give Nicola like this false sense of security that like David's family or who he's with is to be great, which he doesn't even live with his family. He just lives with a group of random guys that he is to just kind of have met through random parts of things. But it also seems like supposedly he used to have a drug ring in his home, but we can't confirm that because there is not a real point in time where they confirm any of that. There's so much about this movie where there's so much kind of throwaway in this film. It's weird how there's so much throwaway. But also let me take a moment here to also just mention the music. I don't know what this music is. Like I don't think this music fits this movie. Or I just kind of feel like whoever did like the music mixing or whatever of this film, like I don't know, it just seems really weird. Like I think they just chose a lot of songs from that time period and like that's all they just decided to really just do is just like, well, let's just use this song weirdly here for whatever reason, but I don't know if it like exactly any of this music really goes with the film. It kind of feels weird. Um it's good music. I like the music. It's just I don't feel like the music fits the film, or I don't feel like the music was done kind of weird or goofy. Where also it kind of felt like the volume of the music just kind of feels weird at some points. Where like the music kind of feels too loud in certain I don't know. Just me probably overly nitpicking or complaining. So, but yeah, so David and Nicole, like David is to kind of mention his parents, Nicole is to mention about her family and her problems and her woes and her whatevers. So eventually, Nicole is to tell David, "Hey, I gotta be home by midnight." And so David decides to go and take her watch, and luckily she had this kind of watch. David ends up adjusting the watch to just be like, hey, we have all the time in the world. And so Nicole eventually goes home late. And so Nicole ends up mentioning to her mother, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm sorry, my watch was broken. Like, or is it was like, there's something wrong with it. I'm sorry. And so eventually Laura is just like, well, fine, whatever. It's like, uh, just wipe all that makeup off you. You look like a slut. So eventually, Steve is to overhear Laura going and talking to Nicole that way. And so Steve is like, "Do you really think that she really like deserved that to be called that? Um, like, don't you think you were a little hard on her?" And so eventually, it starts to get to where it's like, really got to crack down on the girl, or otherwise, like they're just gonna run over on you, run over all of you. So, like it's kind of like there's a moment about like parenting where it's like, okay, like we got to discipline our kid right, or otherwise she'll just continue to do this, and there'll be a consistent pattern of rebelliousness and whatever. Like even though it seems like this girl is like she's a good person, like I always get it like so like weird where there's always a really good kid, but you always still have to just be like, well, like I still don't trust this kid, even though he's been like amazingly good for his whole entire life. Like we're just gonna wait till he like slips up in 1 second, where like all of a sudden he just does one little tiny thing wrong, and then it's like, oh, uh like we really have to crack down on him because he's been so good for his whole entire life. But there's like 1 second where he just did something slightly wrong. We gotta crack down. We gotta throw the book at him. And I'm like, anyways, pushing on. So, because that happens in movies a lot too, where you have this person like through scene one to like forever, you end up having this person that seems to be like a goody two shoes kind of person, and all of a sudden we have the parent that is to do like, I got to take a belt to this kid because I'm like, wait, what? Like, how is it all of a sudden we got from like this kid is like the best, like nicest person to you just got to take a belt to him? Like that seems like going from 0 to like 80, and like this makes no sense. But anyways, so but anyway, pushing on. So, Nicole ends up eventually going off and spending time with David, and it seems like everything is going all good and well at first. And so we get to a point where Steve has to forcibly go to Vancouver, and so he's asking Laura, it's like, well, hey, like, how about this? How about you and me? We go off to Vancouver, we end up getting a hotel room, and we just have some time alone so that way I can win you over because, like, I've made a lot of mistakes recently, and so, hey, uh, kind of, um, let's kind of have fun. So Laura and Steve go off to Vancouver, and so we have Nicole who's deciding it's like, well, this could be the perfect time to eventually kind of have David come over, and we might just kind of take our relationship to the next level because David immediately wanted to go and see Nicole's parents because David is just like, yeah, I really want to like win some brownie points with this girl. So David eventually meets Laura and Steve, and eventually it seems that David has some experience uh, with planting because Laura is need help with some planting stuff, and so David is like, well, hey, I can help you out, and so uh, eventually he is to just kind of give Laura all this information weirdly about planting because I'm assuming or assessing that David at some point had been in some certain uh, kind of environments where it forced him to kind of learn some kind of skill, and I guess this happened to be one of those. So, uh, eventually, when David is to meet up with this family, and Steve is just kind of immediately just like, I don't like this guy. There's something that's rubbing me the wrong way. It seems like this guy is too good to be true. And I think we have a moment where David is to mention that, like something about too good to be true, um, where instead of him saying if something is too good to be like true, like to believe in it or whatever, uh, whereas a lot of people like, well, if something seems too good to be true, like I'm going to like kind of just really kind of like tiptoe my way into here because I don't trust it. Like, but David is to just say the actual opposite. So Steve, after kind of hearing what David's backstory is, David goes and gets a background on this character and is to find out that he lied, that it seems like this guy has been dumped through foster home to foster home to foster home. And that it seems that like Steve had found out some horrible things about David, and so Steve ends up telling Laura about this, and so Laura's like, well, like it seems like he's like a well-adjusted kid. Like maybe there's something about this like background thing that isn't right, or like. But if anything, it seems that Nicole like likes this guy, and so if anything, like if we stop her from going to this guy, she's just gonna run off and get to him anyways because it seems that more and more like Laura is to just say to Steve that Nicole is eventually going to run off and be very rebellious to be with David anyways because it seems like there's something about David that just is so consuming to Nicole. So eventually, of course, we have to mention this spot about the roller coaster where eventually both David and Nicole go to the roller coaster, and so eventually David ends up putting his fingers into Nicole's down belows, let's just say. And so while they have the roller coaster ride, Nicole is getting plagieur from this roller coaster ride, as well as her basically skirt getting blown up, or blown up, so to speak, by the roller coaster. We not only have that, but then we also have the fingering that is to be going on by David. So, uh, and that eventually all escalates to, of course, that David is to go and sleep with Nicole. Uh, Eventually, what is to happen seemingly, we have Nicole who's spending a lot of time with Gary in school. It seems that eventually, like, we have Nicole consistently walking with Gary outside of school. And so eventually, David is to see Nicole spending a lot of time with Gary. And so all of a sudden, David goes and is to uh, grab onto Gary and just start kicking him. And then eventually Nicole is say, "Oh, stop it!" And so David ends up flinging Nicole on the ground, and she ends up getting a shiner for her troubles. And so David is just kicking away at Gary, and so now Nicole is just like, "Oh my god, I think I've made a mistake with David. Like, I think that, like, this is just a wrong guy." So Nicole is to eventually just like, dude, we are freaking donezo. Like, we're done now. But so all of a sudden, we have Nicole, who eventually is going and with Margot, and we end up having a scene early in this movie where both Margot and Nicole are by this pool, and they're to kind of talk about, because evidently, I guess Margot is to have like a Playboy or something like that, some kind of risque magazine over by the pool, and like they're kind of like making the consensus of why any woman would want to display their full body in a magazine, and like both of them are kind of contemplating uh, this whole decision and whatever. Which, like, yeah, like when really looking at it, like Alyssa had gone on to do like a number of films that eventually uh, like the one vampire that she went and did, where eventually she was seemingly topless through that film, and really eventually there's the real talking of why uh, any woman would want to do those kinds of roles, which is kind of understandable, really, at some point, because like 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 some people just want to try something different, or some people just want to uh, eventually kind of own that moment or something like that. So I don't know, could be any number of reasons. So pushing on. So eventually we have David and his friends eventually going and greeting both Margot and Nicole at this pool. And so Nicole is to try and walk off to eventually put back on her clothes to eventually leave. And David is like, well, hey, like, wait a minute, can we just talk for a minute? And so all of a sudden, David is to talk to Nicole and is to just kind of apologize. But then, like, David is to eventually kind of win over Nicole to where they end up getting back together, where we end up having a scene where, and David and Nicole are to eventually be at their pool, kind of like having some fun with eventually Laura, who is now in her swimsuit, and like the whole. So eventually it seems that they've kind of worked everything out. Steve is to all of a sudden just be like, what the heck? What's going on? Like eventually we have at the very beginning of this movie where Steve is just kind of be jogging around and eventually going and grabbing this newspaper before this dog does. And weirdly, I had to bring that up. So Steve ends up coming home and it's like, hey, what's going on? Like, and so Laura's like, hey, we've worked everything out. Like, if anything, Steve, if you want to come in and jump into the pool, by all means. So eventually Steve is just like, what? Like, what did I miss here? So all of a sudden David is just kissing on Nicole and kissing on her forehead, and eventually David is looking at Steve in just like a weird kind of way. So eventually we just have it to where Steve is just kind of like, I don't like this guy. So eventually we just get to the point where Steve is to eventually go and want to talk to David, and so eventually they because Dave is going to go and pick up Nicole, and Steve is to eventually go and drive to Nicole's school to eventually want to talk to David. So they go and park off to the side, and so eventually Steve is to tell David, it's like, you know what, I don't want you by my daughter anymore. Like, if anything, like, it's just like there's something about you that I just don't like. Blah 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 blah. And so like they start to like put all their cards on the table of why they don't really like one another. And so David is just like, well, hey, like if you think that you know me, like I think I also know you. Where David is to rattle off that it seems um, that Steve isn't doing the best at his job, and he plus also isn't doing the best to win over his wife, because it seems that Laura is even finding David and his muscular body so attractive and whatever, and that Laura might be fishing after David's stick, so to speak. I guess they couldn't cuss in this movie, so they had to come up with creative things to eventually say instead of actual cuss words in this film. I don't know why. Maybe I got the censored version of this movie, weirdly enough. But I guess they couldn't cuss in this movie. So eventually, because Steve finds out that eventually Nicole and David were to, of course, have protected sex. And so when Nicole is to be with a shiner and Laura tries to give her makeup tips to hide it, uh, eventually Steve is to think that Dave hit Nicole, and that's the reason why Steven is just so protective of Nicole. Is just like, you know what, like, I think that you're going to hit my daughter again at some point, so I'm not going to let that happen again. So you and her, like, are done. Because also Steve is to think that, like, Nicole is going to possibly ruin her life, or throw her life away by continuing to have probably some sex with David. And so Steve is just wanting to just nip this in the butt, to just be like, I'm sorry, like, I don't want a pregnant teen girl to eventually have to just like give up her future to eventually now have to wield a child, and so on and so forth. And plus, Steve just does not trust Mark, or just does not trust David's character. So, anyways, pushing on. So, after that whole moment is to be over, David is to be punching his chest over and over again. And so, all of a sudden, Nicole is to go to Steve and just be like, oh my god, you are such a hypocrite. Like, because Nicole is to mention uh, that Nicole found bruises all over David that evidently Steve had given him, and so really it's just David doing that to himself, just punching it away, and I'm just like, oh my god. Because I've seen this movie, of course, before. This is my first time watching this film, but still, like, there's so many moments in this movie that are just so, like, oh my god, just this kind of back and forth kind of uh tit for tat kind of thing, where eventually, like, David is to be winning over Nicole, and Steve is to want to eventually try to figure out a way for eventually David to go away. It seems that Steve is actually wanting to try and put a restraining order on David, but it seems like there's legally nothing they can do. And it seems that whenever Steve is to try to do anything the legal way, just things just don't work out. So so eventually what ends up happening is Nicole is to try and figure out for herself uh, what really is to go on with David. And so she ends up going to David's home to kind of look through this window to find out that David is to go and grab Margot's character from Logan. And while Margot is supposedly high, but that doesn't really just like that doesn't change the fact that David's character still grabs Margot by the neck and says like, "Well, hey, like she's mine now," and Margot is going to have to like say uh, that she is his, and so eventually David chucks Margot over his shoulder, slaps her on the batucus, and then eventually walks out. So that's when Nicole is just like, oh no, I am not going to be a part of a relationship where all of a sudden I'm just going to be grabbed like that and to be forced to do any number of things, possibly by David. So that's when Nicole is like, okay, this relationship is to be completely over because now I find out what the real David is, and that's not something that I want to eventually be a part of. So Nicole ends up leaving a note for her dad that it's like, okay, this is finally over. Like I've seen who David really is, and so all of a sudden now we end up having the tit for tat thing going on between both David and both Steve. So eventually we are to have uh, eventually David going and thrashing and destroying Steve's car and leaving a note that says like, "Hey, now I've popped both of your cherries." And so Steve goes off and he ends up demolishing her as quickly as he can, just breaking and everything into David's house. And so now we have the moment where when David and his people end up coming into the home, they're like, "Oh man, we're gonna have to kill the person whoever did this." And David is like, "I know who did this. It's Steve. Like it's obviously Steve." So David is to know the combination of this house's like defenses and whatever. Plus, also, I'm sure they're going to like pull all the phone cords, cut all the electricity and everything. So now we have the moment where, of course, uh, we end up having the people going and just like, dude, we're gonna break into this house, and so, uh, let me kind of finish up this moment really quick. So Nicole is to also kind of confront Argo before this whole thing pops off, and so Margot's characters have mentioned that she was high, and Nicole is like, well, that doesn't make up for the fact that you slept with David, and so eventually Nicole walks off and Margot's like, "Don't go, you're my only friend." And when Nicole was going to eventually double back and just be like, "Well, maybe there's something like we can kind of save here," Margot ends up driving off, and David ends up like kind of chasing her down to say, "Hey, pull over," and then forcibly she does, and then David grabs her from out of her car to just like, okay, like what is wrong with Nicole? And Margot is to say it's like, well, there has to be some kind of reason that Nicole knows that you and me slept together, and so David ends up kissing Margot, and he's like, you know, you liked it, and like walks off. I'm like, oh my god, like there's so much about these scenes where it's just so awful, but it's just like, oh my god, it's like a car crash, and you can't look away. Um, we also had the moment where David is to confront Nicole into this bathroom and is to tell is to tell Nicole that that basically her what's underneath her panties is reserved for her and him and all this stuff, and everything that he's to say here between the both of them, that he loves her and everything like that. It just seems like, wow. This part is just to basically say that David is to tell Nicole hey, I own this, and I'm just like, wow, that is so awful. um and eventually Nicole just tearing up after hearing this whole thing, where basically David in the most weirdest way is to just say that he owns her, and that eventually they're going to run away together or whatever. Uh anyways, so all the walkers, all the Nicole, Steve, Laura, even Argo are to be at this house. So David and his people are to break into this home. So uh, Laura is to mention and have to prepare us that supposedly Steve had set up this house to be a very hard to break into home, and that all the glass that is in the home is really thick, and all the doors are really thick and are hard to break into. And I'm like, isn't that convenient that she has to mention this now, to just, well, I guess there's a reconfirming that Nicole can just say it's well, we're gonna really be safe, right? But she has to really go through of how tough or durable all the doors and all the things are, for these people to break into, to really just help the viewer understand that this house is to be very secured and locked down and whatever. So all these guys start to continue to break through, try to break through these doors and whatever, but it takes them forever, and they just have issues trying to break through this home. So eventually these characters start stacking these tables, start stacking this furniture and all kinds of things to block all these doors. We end up getting to, of course, the moment where eventually they just go through, or when Steve is to eventually look through the keyhole of, and to see David, and eventually we end up having this dialogue through this keyhole where, of course, David's like, "Let me in the house." He's just really aggressive, and because yeah, he's just ticked that his house was destroyed. So now it's basically hey, you ruined my house. We're gonna do the same thing to you. That's kind of the Logan line of things, but still. So, uh, but yeah, I think David was just I don't know how we got to this escalation of this point, but hey, we're here, so let me into your house, kind of thing. So eventually, what ends up happening? So, uh, we eventually have a moment where there was to be this one guy who's kind of drill his way in through one of the glass doors, and so it seems they figured out how to beat this guy off to eventually get him from sneaking into this home. But then eventually they take his drill, and there's to be this one guy who kind of chips away at this door with this axe. And so Laura ends up using this drill to eventually get this guy from trying to open this door, because we have to remember that David knew the combination to this door and tried to open it, and then Steve was like, "Oh crap!" And so he ends blocking the door so that way David doesn't get into the door. So eventually, Nicole is in her room, and she realizes that there is to be some security guard that is to, I guess, see her home from where they are at. And so Nicole has decided to go and flash her lights on and off to, I guess, get this one security guard to see their house with their lights flashing, and just well, okay, I guess I should just head on over there to see what's going on, weirdly. So eventually we have this guard who ends up heading to this home, and eventually is to uh, find people trying to break in. And so this guard ends up going in and is to eventually get Steve And so it seems that both it seems like we're like rescued here. It seems that Steve being with this guard could say it's like okay, like everything's gonna be all good. This guard is eventually going to defend them because it seems like they have this guy has good enough weaponry on him. So we assume this is all resolved, right? No. The guard ends up getting shot and dropped, and so all of a sudden now the numbers game is back into David's favor, and so now they end up going and just beating beating up Steve, and then eventually holding him in front of the door with guns in his face to tell Laura to open the door to let them in. And so Steve is like, "Don't do it," and Laura's like, "I have to." So Laura lets him into the door. They end up cuffing both the parents and eventually putting tape over their mouths. So eventually, Logan ends up going into the home and is to eventually go and grab onto Margot and start to uh, like beat her up. And I think so. Like Logan ends up getting really aggressive with these characters. So what ends up happening is Nicole's brother is to realize that he can go and sneak through his room's window and to eventually make it to the car phone and eventually call 911. So this kid, this pimp of a kid, ends up going and is to open up the garage door, and all of a sudden there's to be this guy there, and so all of a sudden this kid ends up running over this guy, and then he ends up calling 911, and then he ends up re-sneaking it back into the house, seeing that Laura is to need the handcuff keys. The kid ends up going for the handcuff keys and giving it to his mother, and so now we have David into the room with Nicole, and David has Steve, and so, and oh, if I probably mentioned, like, I'll have to mention this in a second because I forgot about David. I forgot about Gary. What happened to Gary? And we'll get to that in a second. So, wow, this is a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. So, we're at an hour now. Crap. So, this is like an hour and 30-minute movie, and I'm almost getting to an hour now. That sucks. Anyways, so, oh well. We've gotten too far. So let's get to the Gary stuff. So, Gary is to eventually be basically grabbed by David. And so David is to really just tell Gary that he has been known to go and bust through a lot of walls, and that eventually every facility that he went to, that eventually he would bust through every single wall because every single wall is weak and whatever. Eventually, these people that worked at these facilities just showed him the door because there was nowhere else for them to just hold this guy up. So, and eventually, like, David is to also mention, it's like, well, yeah, and there's also other kind of walls, fleshy walls and whatever. And I guess David is to see Gary as another wall, to be an obstacle course against Nicole. So eventually, David is to go and take Gary in this forest and snap his neck, and that's the last we see of Gary. So now let's get back to the action. So David is to eventually grab Steve and bring it into Nicole's room, and so Logan is aggressively grabbing onto Nicole, and so David ends up shooting Logan in the head. So now Nicole is to tell, so David is to tell Nicole to say goodbye to her father, because both him and her are going to run away together, get married, and whatever, and that Nicole has to say goodbye to her father because Steve is probably going to get killed after this anyways. So so what ends up happening is that eventually Laura is to come and uncuff Steve. So eventually Steve goes and tries to wrestle with David, and we end up having them being like flung all around this entire room, and it gets really crazy. And so eventually, while both David and Steve are to be tossing around, all of a sudden Nicole is to have this spear and all of a sudden stab uh, David in the back with this, which really doesn't do much, but like still eventually Steve and David continue to tussle around to eventually have Steve go and chuck David through this window, and eventually he smacks onto I guess this rocky like surface and ends up getting just killed off because of I guess the distance that he had been thrown. So I guess really just after that moment, I guess everyone is to have either ran away or to realize that the cops had been called. So eventually, whoever is not dead at this point is to have been arrested. I don't know. Like after this moment, like the movie just kind of ends to where we are just to naturally assume that everybody had a happy ending at the end of this. So with that said, I think that's all I wanted to say about this movie because I spent an hour and X amount of minutes, whatever, talking about this movie, and it's an hour and 30, so I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.